this week is someone who I think has told stories from those who suffer history better than many people over the last few years. He's Daniel Trilling, former editor of New Humanist, writer, and the author of Bloody Nasty People, which was an expose on the British right, and most recently Lights in the Distance from 2018, which is an extraordinary chronicle of migrant and refugee voices, of those who've been crossing Europe's borders for the last 10 years. I was thinking also a lot about how things like Windrush, Grenfell, things to do with numbers and identity and bodies and race and racism and policy and the shift right were like the earlier chapter in the same story to what is happening now.
You mentioned the Grenfell fire and the Windrush scandal as, in a way, kinds of precursors to what's happening now. I'd probably also add, the death toll in the Mediterranean.
Yes, yes.
And the scale of what was happening, at Europe's borders during the peak of the refugee crisis. And yeah, I mean, I've thought that in a way, a couple of things. I think on the level of sort of statistics and numbers and counting the dead, one thing that I feared throughout the spread of the pandemic is the moment that the shocking death toll becomes a kind of background noise, and that it loses its immediate shock value and then gets absorbed into the wider background of shocking and terrible statistics that are then reported on as if they were kind of like the weather or something, or were still then not reported on. I don't know if you saw, there was a front page of the Sun newspaper a week or two ago that had the main story was about whether or not pubs would reopen, and I think it was a kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek tone to it, and then there was a little flash that just said, X number of people dead, see page 4. And that was the moment I thought, okay, this is now starting to happen.
That's
even with this, where I think it's not just a British thing, but I think within British media and political discourse, there's a very well practiced way of shoving these kind of events into the background, so they either become a fact of life, unfortunate, but it's there, what are you going to do, we're trying our best, or worse still, the victims start getting blamed for their own misfortune. And I think you saw elements of that in responses to the Grenfell fire, certainly. To go further back, it's something that was there with the Hillsborough disaster. I think that's one of the things that cast a long shadow over British politics in that respect. And then just to reiterate, this isn't unique to Britain. I think the various reactions to Europe's refugee crisis saw these kind of hostile or indifferent discourses developing around what was happening. But also, I think the role that statistics play within this is that they provide, that's the thing that really gets fought over. And I wonder sometimes if that sort of obscures more important things. Not to say that statistics aren't important, or looking at the kind of sum total of the damage caused by a particular event or a particular decision isn't important. But the obvious things that get missed there are ways in which to describe an event or a catastrophe that relates it to people's lives on other levels. The obvious one would be what that means in terms of impacts on individuals and families and smaller communities that are easier for people to imagine or imagine themselves part of. But also, I think what gets missed out is looking at the nature of the response to disasters. And I think the other way in which those recent events strike a chord with what's happening now, certainly at least in my impression, is the way in which you've, in the last decade or so, you've had a series of sort of catastrophic events of varying scale, some horrible accidents, others a result of policy, but increasingly the responses to them have revealed that in various ways the state isn't there when people maybe assumed it would be,
Yes.
to pick up the pieces, or to support people. And what you have instead is this kind of sort of neoliberal free-for-all where you get this strange and quite antagonistic mix of volunteer-led responses, you know, business interests trying to get in and trying to buy up bits of what the state is doing and provide services on the state's behalf, and then kind of very complex and murky NGO world where you have all of these different groups acting for a variety of different reasons, many of which are entirely admirable. But that can range from things like, you know, large semi-corporate global aid agencies to small groups of political activists to, you know, billionaires who buy a boat and want to sail it around the Mediterranean rescuing people for whatever reason they have. And what happens there is, you know, there's a real lack of accountability, I think, and in even just putting all the pieces together and saying, well, you know, being able to understand what's happening in total when it's made up of all these different fragmented pieces of different responses and different people involved for different reasons. And I think you can see that happening again now.
That's really interesting because it makes either well, moral justice or what we now call social justice, let alone criminal justice, as a lot of human rights lawyers will tell you, really difficult because, you know, we haven't got the heroes and villains. One thing, we got used to that a long time ago. And a sense of a kind of, well, that's just what it is. I mean, that horrible expression that came in, we are where we are, it is what it is, that is producing this moral political landscape, which is very difficult to live in and indeed to die in, as we're discovering. I want to go back to something you just said there, which is about, you know, how you describe these new realities or how we describe the now. What is your sense of what the virus is doing to the migrant landscape and migrant lives now, and how has that changed, or what's the next chapter from Lights in the Distance? Well,
I mean, obviously it's made me think about the people that I met during the course of my research for that book. Some, you know, some of whom I'm still in touch with and others I'm not. And particularly as Italy is a place that I did a lot of the research in, and that was the first country to have, you know, such a drastic lockdown imposed in Europe. It made me immediately think, I wonder how, you know, so-and-so is doing in Sicily or in Naples or wherever. You know, a few people I've contacted and spoken to, but rather than their individual situations, what's probably more interesting about it is, first of all, the way in which I think there's already been some discussion, you know, refugees who are writers or journalists have already produced material about that compares their experiences of war or fleeing war to what's happening now. But the thing that struck me was sort of the ways in which so often the situations I encountered people in Europe and the UK were that while they were claiming asylum or trying to find some other kind of resolution to their situations, they were in these prolonged states of waiting. Yeah. You know, the limbo that the system put them in. And in a way, that's what most of us to varying degrees are now in and dealing with. So I keep thinking, for example, about there's a Syrian family that I met in Bulgaria in 2014 who are now in Germany and who I went to visit at different points on their journey. And I was always struck by how often the members of the family that I knew were just glued to their phones in a way that I felt was sometimes trying to shut out the reality of where they were, you know, the town around them, because they didn't really want to be there, particularly when they were kind of in a place that was just a transit stop between where, you know, where they'd left and where they ultimately wanted to end up. And that what they would be doing would be looking at, you know, videos shared among the Syrian refugee diaspora, or stuff relating to the places they'd left back home, you know, how the development of the war in Syria, videos from their hometown, or, you know, totally escapist stuff like football, TV, whatever. And it's just, I just keep thinking about that when I realise that I've spent yet another hour scrolling through Twitter.
Yes.
You know, sitting on my sofa, or just even looking at the way that people who I follow on Twitter are now using social media. It's clearly, it's a way of dealing with the fact that a lot of the rest of their lives are on hold. Yeah, the idea of lockdown, quarantine, states kind of trying to divide up people and keep them separate for various reasons. And I think the experience of refugees and migrants in Europe is one thing we should be, I think, be very aware of at the moment, because it really illustrates the ways in which that can be done incredibly brutally and in a way that harms people, and also creates really negative political consequences as well. You know, stokes the very backlash that the measures are supposedly there to prevent, for example. It's not just as a, you know, kind of symbolic warning that these kind of things could happen to us. It's also that the pandemic is causing governments around Europe to now treat refugees, migrants, other marginalized groups such as Roma communities already in more brutal ways than they were being treated previously. So I've actually, one of the recent bits of work that I've been doing has been to try and track what's happening to these communities as the pandemic develops. And one of the patterns that I think you're starting to see emerge in certain parts of Europe is the use by governments of what really goes beyond quarantine measures. They're kind of in sort of militarized cordons to close off groups of people that governments would rather not bother with. So in Slovakia and Bulgaria, there's been a series of reports of Roma settlements just being completely closed off by the police. You know, when there's been reports of 1 or 2 cases of coronavirus there. And rather than act in the interest of the safety of the people who live there, they're just shutting everybody in together. The Italian police in Rome did something very similar with a squat that several hundred African migrants live in. So they just surrounded it with fences and sent the military in to stop anybody going in and going out. And you know, there were reports saying that in that squat, you know, 18 people shared one toilet, for example. So it's again a form of bordering that is not actually in the interest of public health, but is based on pre-existing stigma around which groups of people are kind of dirty and undesirable, and they're therefore a threat to the wider community. And I think that A, that's already happening to people in parts of Europe, but B, it shows the quite unpleasant ways in which the various forms of state control that we're currently consenting to could develop if they're not restrained and subject to democratic accountability, I think.